Good morning. Welcome to Panel E, uh, which is fostering a skill set to negotiate pernicious information. I didn't note, actually, Catherine, of course, is also a PhD. My apologies. Those are my two colleagues. I'm going to talk about negotiating the changing digital ecosystem, or welcome to the disinformation age. So I will talk about some of the significant challenges we confront, especially in relation to social media. My colleagues will explore an endeavor to diagnose the problem from various angles of literacy. So first, I want to distinguish between misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories. Misinformation is basically inaccurate, false, or misleading information that is communicated irrespective of intention to deceive the readers. It might include insults, pranks, false rumors, but it might also include information disseminated erroneously through official channels, like public health agencies. Disinformation is a subset of misinformation that is deliberately deceptive. It could include malicious hoax, spear phishing, and computational propaganda. Sorry, I'm having some issues with my timer. Conspiracy theories, which present a significant problem and which seems to be growing in popularity and becoming more mainstream. The goal is to provoke fear and suspicion among a group of people because information is believed to be credible and communicated as if it were true. So we've done collectively, this group has done some work looking at fake news, looking at erroneous health information, and we can characterize a continuum from fake news, which is outright fraud and deception, commercial products that have specious claims, often using elements of deception, mixed with facts and mischaracterization of evidence, legitimate natural health products, which claims far exceed evidence, controversial treatments with limited scientific evidence, and scientific and public health controversies, which emphasize advocacy rather than commerce. So the vaccine hoax is a classic example of that. The World Health Organization made the claim that we were in the midst of an infodemic. This is an overflow of information, including false or misleading details. It was parallel to the COVID pandemic. Negative impact include increased confusion, risky behaviors jeopardizing health, distrusted health authorities, and that has the impact of undermining the public health response. Intensification or prolonged use of outbreaks due to public uncertainty about protective measures. So it's driven by the growing digitization, such as the rise of social media and internet use, which leads to faster information spread. On the positive side, it can fill information voids quickly, sometimes with productive, proactive news, but it could also amplify harmful messages. So access to reliable and online crisis and emergency risk information are, of course, essential for communicating critical prevention and mitigation efforts, particularly in a time of crisis. But COVID misinformation and conspiracy theories were fueled by populist opposition to science, revealed that social media is the greatest threat to vaccine uptake and, in effect, ending the pandemic. And of course, this is still ongoing, and debates still continue to rage in many quarters and permeates our politics in very significant ways. So infodemics has complicated the search for reliable information. It's propagated rumors, which spread quickly, putting public health at risk, making it difficult to implement effective preventive measures. The internet was infested with dangerous conspiracy theories, propaganda, specious scientific claims regarding diagnosis, treatment, and prevention of disease. And That has its peaks and valleys. It certainly hasn't gone away. So unchecked health information on social media makes it difficult for the general public to identify accurate information, therefore hindering an effective public health response. So it also leads to a distrust in institutions. And who do you trust? Who is the source of truth? That is a significant challenge. So which brings us to social media infrastructure and social media platforms, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this. Of course, it goes without saying that the internet is pervasive, has almost 5 billion active users, which is over 60% of the global population. I assume that figure is greater today because it grew over the course of the pandemic. It can lead to rapid development and diffusion of information and communication, and it's a dominant communication channel for disseminating health information. Of course, that could be a positive, but there's a significant downside to that. Health professionals rightly advocated for the use of social media to bolster dissemination of essential public health information. Presently and moving forward, it's a ubiquitous part of health and healthcare. So I'm going to talk briefly about different platforms, actually very briefly. They all have different modes of engagement. They have enormous active monthly user base, massive user base. They're not necessarily, I'm not suggesting that they have malicious intent. We could think about a parallel to the tobacco industry, circa 1950s. They wanted to sell a product. They wanted their product to appeal cool, really to appeal to younger users, etc. There is a parallel. Of course, there's limitations to that analogy. So Facebook has almost 3 billion users, and they use a range of engagements. And so they all have somewhat different strategies, but also they try to really engage the users, get them to become active participants, and so on and so forth. And so they all have different forms of engagement, but they also all share a common set of actions in which people can like and people can join various groups and people can subscribe and people can watch video content. So here are some dimensions of social media that make it very compelling. So it's attention-driven design for revenue. And we could think about the parallel to the tobacco industry. It's platform engineered to seize and retain users' attention, as this directly impacts advertising revenue. It's derived from important HCI principles, which are utilized to make platforms both addictive and engaging. Prioritization of sensational content, we could argue whether that is deliberate or not, but the focus on retaining attention can promote sensational, emotionally charged content, including health misinformation, and that keeps users hooked. It's got a massive user base. So a Pew Internet survey revealed that 44% of the US population gets their news from Facebook. And it boasts user numbers in the billions. Now, there's a challenge in getting news from social media. So there's an obfuscation of content origin, which is crucial in the spread of information and how social, So basically, the source, it may look very legitimate, but it's not. It has a different kind of origin that's very different from a legitimate media website. There's something known as the bandwagon heuristic, and it's amplified through social media by using visible metrics like likes, share, and comments. So there's evidence to suggest that the rate at which beliefs and trends are adopted increases in relation to how many have already done so. So in other words, it's self-propagating, self-perpetuating messages with more likes and more shares and more comments that grows and grows. So as I was mentioning, posts that receive high engagement are more likely to capture attention and further information. um, it has the potential to muddy public discourse. So there's a cyclical nature of social media engagement, and that unfortunately contributes to the spread of unverified information. This complicates the landscape of public knowledge and discourse, and it's especially salient during the recent pandemic. So briefly, I'll talk about the world of bots. There are a lot of different sources of misinformation. Uh, so these are software tools that automated tasks, but also can be used for sowing disinformation and conducting cyber attacks. So all social media platforms use content recommendation algorithms to push content to users. It's a very powerful tool. And they often prioritize popular posts for engagement without considering accuracy. So so-called bad bots mimic human interaction and account for a significant portion of internet traffic. They can facilitate malicious activities. There's been a significant increase in bad bot traffic on healthcare websites. One report suggested that it's almost 400% since September 2020. One bot was observed making as many as 12,000 vaccine appointment requests per hour. So bots on social media spread conspiracy theories and create the false impression of widespread endorsement. There are a variety of means of amplifying disinformation and dubious information. So I mentioned algorithmic intermediaries. They're configured to match users' preferences and attitudes, and they serve to promote content and disseminating information tailored to a particular user. There's a departure from traditional news models. So reliance on algorithms has significant implications for how social perceptions are shaped, narratives are framed, and, for example, political communication on contentious issues is provided. There's also confirmation bias. Users frequently leads toward information that conforms with pre-existing worldviews, often ignoring or dismissing opposing perspective. So that's one of the framing references. It appeals to, and it further promotes the confirmation bias. In our society, there are polarized communities, and the tendency towards confirmation bias furthers that, centered around shared narratives. For example, vaccine and microchips, vaccine causing challenges with potency and many other issues. It's a fertile ground for misinformation, characterized by high levels of polarization. So it's really an ideal environment for rapid and wide-scale dissemination. We hear a lot about echo chambers. So with different groups, you have members with congruent interests and beliefs. And within these communities, there's social reinforcement mechanisms such as shared posts, likes, and followers, establishing a perpetual feedback loop. So this encourages heightened engagement among ideological similar individuals, fosters social cohesion, particularly among those inclined towards conspiracy theories. And that represents a very significant challenge. I'm not going to say too much about AI, but it's changing the landscape. And it's just beginning to change the landscape. So there are a lack of guardrails for AI technologies. I know there was some executive action around AI, but this is just beginning to play out. So AI tools can generate text, images, video, and audio, making it much easier to create large quantities of fake content. Of course, there's a lot of upsides to AI technology as well, but here I'm talking about it in the context of disinformation and conspiracy theories. So social platforms have policy to address misinformation and synthetic content, but enforcement and detection may lag behind AI advancements. And, there is, I think, the incentive for social media platforms to mitigate misinformation significantly varies over time. So AI-generated content not only misleads users, but also undermines trust in real information, impacting various aspects, for example, including voting and crisis situations, such as a health pandemic. So this is really going to play out over the next decade, and there are a lot of challenges that we have in this regard. I want to wrap up. So I'll talk briefly about the COVID infodemic. So of course, that's the greatest public health crisis of our generation. There's been an equally lethal infodemic of politicized information. I talked a little bit about that, driven in part by populist opposition to science and institutions that fuel the spread of misinformation and mistrust, inaccurate and false information. Disinformation, intentionally disseminated, is used to deceive or financial gain, posing a threat to both democracy and public health. So initially, the federal COVID-19 response was marked by confusion and inconsistencies, and this undermined the credibility of institutions and trust in public health. And this is an ongoing problem. So in the context of the pandemic, there are limited access to credible information sources. There were also deficits in critical thinking and media literacy skills that Dr. Kesselman will talk about, complicating the search for reliable COVID information. There was political discourse, of course, promoting fake news and alternative facts, contributing to mistrust in mainstream media and a distrust of contradicting information. So social media plays a significant role in the spread of news and information, as I mentioned, with half of the US adults relying on social media. And there's the intentional use of disinformation, exemplified by malicious lies like the Sandy Hook massacre hoax, and this has far-reaching consequences for both democracy and public health. There's been a dramatic increase in social media use during the pandemic. Social media became a primary source of COVID-19 disinformation worldwide. Over 40% of social media posts related to COVID-19 contained information from unreliable sources, and as much as 42% were circulated by bots. So a significant percentage of adults have been exposed to COVID-19 related information. Social media has played a major role. False claims and pseudoscientific therapies unfortunately undermine vaccination campaigns and reduced intent to vaccinate. And I'll end by saying that, we're at the beginning of understanding this process. There are a host of very complicated socio-cultural issues that extend well beyond health literacy. But I think understanding health literacy and promoting it in different ways is crucially important. And I will hand that off to my colleague, Dr. Alla Kesselman. And I will stop sharing.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to start sharing my screen. I hope my colleagues David or Catherine will give me a thumbs up or thumbs down once we go into this. Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Okay, it's a pleasure to be here. Hello, my name is Alla Kesselman, and I'm coming from the National Library of Medicine. So let's talk about the skill set that may provide safeguards against misinformation. At the end of his presentation, Dr. Kaufman talked about factors that may influence people's health beliefs. This talk is about one of them, namely scientific literacy, which is not given sufficient attention in public health. So the previous presentation discussed in depth perils of digital health misinformation. Of course, digital e-health universe is also filled with quality resources. We would not be here in this field if we did not believe this. The challenge for the consumer is telling them apart and finding what is useful. Unfortunately, we know that misinformation often gets propagated faster than good information because people are more likely to share it. This happens for several reasons. First, sensationalism feels more newsworthy. Also, in the domain of health and medicine, people search for hope, which means they often search for cure. And there are always those who build their popularity on selling cures for the incurable. Please note almost 2 million views under the video that promises to cure cancer in 3 minutes. One particular kind of misinformation is rumors, and those tend to upload at the times of social tension and uncertainty. The recent COVID-19 pandemic provided us with an illustration. The example on this slide is from my favorite social anthropologist, Dr. Alexandra Arhipova. It comes from a conversation she overheard in a Moscow grocery store in September 2021, and it contains a theme she found in many social media conversations. I'm going to read it. So this is a conversation between 2 people in a Moscow grocery store. One says, "Don't get vaccinated." Why? They put Lucifer genes inside it. Everybody who got the vaccine starts to hate God. Better stay home and drink more hot tea. This is a good prevention against COVID. I love this example because of what an amalgamation of belief systems it is. There are Lucifer and God, but also science, and apparently, speak of scientific literacy, Lucifer has a genome, and it has an all-powerful home remedy, hot tea, and coming from Ukraine, I can attest to its superior status in Eastern European home care. So in discussing scientific literacy as a safeguard, I'd like to start with a prominent model of e-health literacy developed by Norman and Skinner in 2006, which echoes the factors that Dr. Kaufman discussed earlier. The model comprises 6 factors or 6 literacies that are needed to navigate online health information effectively. These are computer literacy, or the ability to use computers and other digital information devices, information literacy, or the ability to articulate information needs and locate and evaluate information. Information literacy involves knowing how to formulate a query and how to evaluate legitimacy of a source. Media literacy, number 3, is fluency with different information formats and sources. Number 4, conventional literacy and numeracy. These are reading comprehension skills and quantitative skills that Dr. Anker discussed in her keynote presentation yesterday. I'm going to skip scientific literacy for just a moment because we will get back to it. And I will not focus on health literacy because I have no doubt that this audience is very familiar with both the concept and the challenge in coming up with an elegant definition for it. So let's get back to scientific literacy. The concept is from the field of science education research, where a small group of persistent researchers try to understand the impact of science education on the lives of non-scientists. As often happens, the first step to understanding the impact of something is defining it. And at a close look, science competency or scientific literacy can be described as having 3 components. These are knowledge of science, knowledge about science, and attitude towards science. So let's consider them in turn. What is knowledge of science? Knowledge of science is knowing scientific facts and understanding the relationship between them, as well as understanding scientific processes, models, and mechanisms. For example, it's things like knowing that organisms are composed of cells and cells contain organelles. It is also knowing the difference between virus and bacteria and what the difference means in the context of taking antibiotics. It may also be knowing that vaccines may contain bits of viral material, but not bits that can replicate and cause disease. Can knowledge of science matter in real life? Yes, of course. Let's take my last example. Believing that vaccine may cause disease against which it is supposed to protect is a common misconception. Some biological knowledge may provide context for a discussion about how antigens cannot replicate, which may dispel that misconception. Knowledge about science. Knowledge about science is understanding principles of the scientific method, such as control of variables, sampling, and looking for convergent evidence across multiple studies. It also involves understanding science as a social enterprise, including who funds it, how findings are shared, via publication and peer review, and how these processes are not bias-proof, but conspiracy-proof. Can knowledge of science matter in dealing with health information? It can. Imagine a person with a rare neurological disease encountering a book that promotes a very restrictive high-fat diet as a cure. She reads the book. The author is a general medicine doctor who recommends this diet to her patients and observes that it improves their symptoms. Understanding the weakness of this evidence, when there is no control group and no peer review, may make the reader cautious and prompt her to explore deeper. Attitude towards science, the third component. Attitude towards science is the belief about its value as a method of obtaining knowledge about the natural world. On the normative level, it is the belief that science is the best way available to us because it is more bias-proof than others, conspiracy-proof and self-correcting. Attitude also involves assumptions that the intent behind science. It also includes the assumption that science is useful and benevolent. So I just hopefully made a case for scientific literacy, that scientific literacy matters and we should pay more attention to it. Does it always matter? How much does it matter? Do the three components of scientific literacy matter equally? Is it in our control to make it matter more? The answer is, it is complicated. Let's look at knowledge of science again. It certainly matters in many situations, and this is especially evident in cross-cultural studies that compare participants with and without traditional conventional schooling experience. But then, much of health information is very scientifically complex. The first example on this slide is from the CDC website, debunking myths about COVID. This particular myth is that COVID vaccines alter the DNA. And the explanation illustrates the challenge of debunking it by providing and appealing to the knowledge of science. This content is just too complex, and it's not reasonable to expect that somebody with an average understanding of science based on a high school science class or even a basic college science class will be able to understand it and really evaluate it on the basis of their science knowledge alone. The second example just illustrates that often biomedicine is complex and health professionals may know that something is effective without understanding its mechanism of action. So knowledge of science alone is not a panacea against misinformation. Science may also clash with ideology. And we know that some science-related issues like vaccination or climate change are characterized by highly partisan beliefs. The important question is, when science education and science knowledge counter ideology, do they counter ideology or not? So on this slide, there is a very interesting study where participants who identified either as liberal Democrats or conservative Republicans were asked whether they believe that there is solid evidence that climate change is mostly due to human activity. So this first diagram is a prediction if science would trump ideology. So if we were to expect this, then liberal Democrats would agree with the statement that climate change is caused by human activity, regardless of their knowledge of science, because it's already consistent with, this belief is already consistent with their ideology. While for conservative Republicans, we would expect the growing trend, the correlation between science education and agreement that climate change was caused by human activity. This is not what we get in reality. In reality, when you look at how conservative Republicans answer this question, they're less likely to agree that climate change is caused by human activity as their level of science education increases. Why is that? One possible answer is identity protective cognition. So when belief is important to identity, we use our knowledge and our cognitive resources not to examine it, but to justify it and to defend it. Here is another example of how identity protective cognition may be more significant than knowledge. This example is from the Daily Podcast episode that went on air in 2021 during the COVID pandemic, and it showed efforts by a rural doctor in Tennessee to convince patients in his community to vaccinate. So one of his conversations with his family was actually on the air. The patient was a gentleman in his 70s, and the doctor was trying to convince him to accept COVID vaccination. The patient viewed COVID very seriously. He knew people who died of COVID. He was concerned, and yet he was also concerned about vaccination. When the physician asked him why, the patient explained that he was concerned about microchips in the vaccine. The doctor went into the explanation that the injection is given with a needle. The opening in the needle is not wide enough to contain a microchip. It turned out that the patient is a retired, I think, electrical engineer. So he acknowledged that, yes, actually, it makes sense. I mean, it does not make sense that a chip would fit inside the vaccine. It was a long and respectful conversation, but at the end of the conversation, the patient still did not agree to receive the vaccine. We talked about attitudes towards science. Few people explicitly reject science. Even though in today's media, we hear many voices about the falling trust in science. What does falling trust in science mean? So while people rarely explicitly reject science as a way of obtaining knowledge, the problem is with distrust in the societal structures that fund and drive science. This is often expressed as trusting science, but not trusting scientists or the scientific establishment. Science, especially the science of public health, are part of the establishment, and one's trust in the establishment depends on the sociocultural context and experience in one's community. Minority groups have historical reasons for medical mistrust. I'm sure you're familiar with the US Public Health Service syphilis study at Tuskegee, as well as many other studies and practices that conducted ethical violations against vulnerable groups. With this, it's not surprising that members of these groups are very cautious when it comes to accepting public health messages from government organizations, and that a lot of work needs to go into rebuilding trust. So far, I've been making a case that scientific literacy is important, but far from all-powerful. Can we make it matter more? To consider this question, we need to remember that scientific literacy is largely a product of science education in our school system. The question then becomes, do we teach science education in a way that is most conducive to dealing with science in real life? Peter Fensham is a prominent science education researcher who analyzed science curricula across countries and grade levels and pointed out that while over 90% of the most important domains of science applications in the 21st century are very complex, science taught in schools almost always draws on simple, predictable models and examples. Complex scientific systems are characterized by nonlinearity and uncertainty, but this is not how school science education presents science. As a result, students may come out with an idealized view of science that leads to disillusionment when it encounters reality. In conclusion, I'd like to focus on how scientific literacy interacts with other literacies and factors that affect dealing with health information. This is a study that I did with my colleagues, some of whom are presenting in this panel, done in the context of COVID vaccination. We recruited 140 participants and assessed them on a number of variables that are known to impact dealing with health information in various situations. These are religiosity, political ideology, information literacy, knowledge about science, attitudes towards science, interpersonal trust or tendency to believe that in general most people can be trusted, and trust in public health establishments such as CDC, NIH, FDA, healthcare providers, and biomedical researchers. In this case, we were interested in how these factors influence three dependent variables: general attitude towards vaccination and attitude towards COVID-19 vaccines. First, we measured individual effects because practical interventions target them individually. When we looked at individual effects of our independent variables on the dependent variables, attitude towards science had a large effect on general vaccination attitude and medium effect on COVID vaccination attitude, while knowledge about science had medium effect on general vaccination attitude. Other variables were also significant with different strengths of effect. When we looked at a model with all the independent variables in, the number of significant predictive factors fell to three for each dependent variable. This was not surprising, as we do expect a lot of mutual influence across the variables. What stood out prominently with respect to scientific literacy is the importance of attitude and trust. Attitude towards science mattered more than knowledge about science. We also got evidence suggesting that politicized science topics fare differently. While general vaccination attitude was not affected by party affiliation in this model, COVID vaccination attitude was. So what do we take from this study? We learned that the public's attitude towards vaccination is influenced by a multitude of factors, and these factors operate in a complex manner. We also learned that attitude towards COVID-19 vaccines were shaped somewhat differently from attitudes towards vaccination in general. Most importantly, we saw that trust in the science establishment and public health establishment are of paramount importance. And so what are the practical takeaways from my talk and from the studies I reviewed? How do we promote scientific literacy so that it supports public health? Well, first, we should recognize and acknowledge that science isn't perfect and promote understanding of uncertainty and complexity as inherent to science rather than aberrations or something accidental. At the same time, we should foster understanding of the mechanisms that make science self-correcting. We should foster understanding of the mechanisms that make science self-correcting, conspiracy resistant, and for that reason, a preferred way of learning about the natural world. We should also introduce science as a social enterprise and acknowledge its social context. Because trust is grounded in relationship, we should support the public's engagement with science and scientists and we should always understand concerns and be respectful and exercise cultural humility, because building relationship requires patience, respect, and persistence. Thank you very much. We will answer questions at the end of the third presentation, but because many of the thoughts I presented here are summarized in my chapter in this book, which also has chapters by other presenters in this conference, I wanted to show the book in closing. Thank you very much, and I'm passing the microphone to Dr. Catherine Arnott-Smith.
Thanks, Alla. Tell me with a thumb when I am sharing successfully. Thank you. Welcome, folks, to my piece of the talk, which is called Patient Portal Panic, Open Notes, and Health Literacy. So what's Open Notes? You all have them, whether you know it or not. It was a movement born in 2012, which began as a collaborative experiment between 3 medical centers in Boston, rural Pennsylvania, and Seattle. And the notes are textual summaries of doctor visits. 20,000 patients were given the opportunity to read their notes, documenting their visits using their patient portals. And a very high proportion, as high as 87% in the 3 centers, agreed that the notes, quote, helped them feel more in control of their care, unquote. A small minority, 1 to 8%, depending on the center, said that, quote, the notes caused confusion, worry, or offense. The Open Notes Movement webpage, the URL on the slide, features a long list of references to relevant research published since the movement started, including this very important first study, which cites more positives than negatives out of this encounter. I've given you that citation so you can chase down the free article, which is the best place to start. But like Wikipedia, it's not the place to stop. Flash forward to 2021, April 2021, when Open Notes became the law of the land through the Cures Act. This federal rule gives patients access to all the health information in their electronic medical records, quote, without delay, unquote, and without charge. This means that if you have had an encounter with the US healthcare system, you now have access to texts like this. I want to stress this isn't text from anybody's actual record. This is sample text, which was up for a long time on the website of AHRQ, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. Now, unfortunately, it's only available through the Wayback Machine, but this is a screenshot from the Wayback Machine. So Open Notes usage has been measured in different ways, which you can read about at the Open Notes website. To illustrate recent trends, I like to use the Health Information National Trends Survey, or HINTS, from the National Cancer Institute, which started asking questions about online access to medical records in 2017. HINTS is an initiative of the National Cancer Institute, but it's important to understand these are surveys not of cancer patients specifically, but of the general adult population through different means that they explain on the HINTS website in 2022 for the first time using both web and paper forms. Open Notes, remember, was first launched, although it wasn't mandated federally yet, in the US in 2012. Just since 2017, the HINTS survey takers have asked respondents, have you ever been offered online access to your medical records by your healthcare provider? And in 2022, 6,252 respondents showed up. There was an estimated 70.3% who said they had been offered such access in 2022, 11.8% accessing their records 10 or more times. So while the availability of clinical notes in a patient portal is, of course, a historically recent phenomenon, the question of how patients relate to their own notes is a much older research question. And the roots of what we now call open notes can be found in the consumer movements of the 1970s. In the 1970s, access to your own medical record was unusual. In 1974, important federal legislation was passed, the Privacy Act, which naturally, because it was a federal law, generated a commission tasked with investigating challenges to data privacy in different contexts, including medical contexts. So this commission prepared a report, which came out in 1977, and it's freely available online, in which they commented it is still rare for an individual to be allowed to see, let alone much less copy, a medical record pertaining to himself, sick, or to check the accuracy, timeliness, or completeness of the information it contains. So you can see the need for advocacy around patient access to medical records right there, and that's what happened. The ability of the patient to improve the quality of the record was one important reason that advocates wanted patients to be able to see their own records. Another important argument was that access was educational, that medical records could be part of ongoing self-education on the part of the patient, which would in turn enable smarter health consumer behavior. Critics, however, argued that the original language of medical records is professional language, it's technical language, and that patients wouldn't be able to understand what they were reading, which reduced their educational value. And a related anxiety expressed by the critics in the 1970s going on to today is the fear that this lack of understanding would result in patients worrying about what they read. Was it actually harmful then to give patients access to their own records? So from the very beginning of the argument over access, both medical terminology and patient comprehension of terminology have been recognized as potential challenges to meaningful access. So, medical record technology has changed a great deal, of course, since the dawn of the patient access movement, but these concerns are still very much with us, as was revealed to me in the healthcare professional literature after the Open Notes study was published in 2012. I did a deep scan of the medical literature in PubMed in early September of this year. And I identified 192 published articles there, which had come out since that initial work in 2012 by Delbenko et al. About those 3 medical centers and the 20,000 patients. These were all articles that explicitly referenced open notes as a movement and an incentive for the research. Of these 192 articles, 32% were what I'm calling on the slide patient-centric. They were studies in which patients were the focus of interest. 21% focused on physicians. 7% focused on aspects of clinical text itself, but not on humans, either humans that generated clinical text or read clinical text. And if you're wondering, yes, of course, there was overlap between these 3 sets. For example, some articles reported studies of patients and their physicians at the same time, but this didn't happen a whole lot. It was no more than 8% of the total. So it's interesting to me that the largest proportion of these articles was what I've called other-centric on the slide. This reflects both the run-up to the federal mandate and the reaction in the wake of the federal mandate. Open Notes has frankly generated a lot of professional conversation. Articles in this category weren't research studies. They were commentaries, op-eds, position papers, N of 1 reports, system design pieces, implementation reports, that sort of thing. The findings I'm going to talk about on the next few slides exclude all of those. I was trying to get a handle on just what research had been done investigating the terminology challenge of open notes from a health literacy point of view. And the answer turns out to be not much. A chunk of the literature in this domain consists of prospective studies in which patients were asked about their opinions about patients in general seeing their notes, or physicians were asked about their opinions about patients in general seeing their notes. Of the 61 patient-centric studies, just 46 asked patients about their experiences reading their own specific actual notes. Of those 46, just 18 asked the patients about the readability or understanding of those notes. And of those 18, exactly 4 used validated health literacy instruments that were direct measures. Here's what the direct measures were on this slide. I should note that some studies used multiple instruments, so it's going to add up to more than 4 of the 18, in which patients were assessed for anything around understanding of what they read in the note. So it's the usual suspects, frankly. It's, short TOEFL, realm, newest vital sign, literacy screeners, and e-heals, which was mentioned in my colleague Dr. Kesselman's talk just now. Now, a slightly bigger proportion of those studies used 2 of the brief screening questions developed by Chu, Bradley, and Boyko in 2004, and I've put the citation on the last slide of this presentation. This is an instrument used to identify patients who have low health literacy, and it's based on self-report. So the 2 questions that were used were, how often do you have someone help you read hospital or medical materials? And how confident are you filling out medical forms by yourself? Again, these brief screening questions were used in combination with some of the instruments on the previous slide. So, how do we actually know what patients understand of what they're reading? Here's what's left of those 18 studies. It's understanding as measured by confusion by self-report. So the Open Notes group from the beginning has relied on the note reader's self-report of how confused they are by what they read. In the original 2012 study, this is what they did. From 1 to 8% of patients reported that the notes caused confusion, worry, or offense. Of those 18 studies in which readability or understanding of notes was assessed, 44% were relying on this original confusion question or variants on the confusion theme, such as it made me made me confused about my medications. Yes, no. How confusing were the visit notes on a scale? The notes would be more confusing than helpful. Agree, disagree. From 0 to almost 15% of participants reported confusion, an average of 5.6% across those 8 studies. The other self-reported thing, which occurred less often, just twice, was the patient or caregiver's perceived understanding of what they read. So on average, 11% of participants reported lower or no understanding of their note or of their test result, with questions like this: how well did you understand your note/result? Completely to not at all. How much of what was in the note do you understand? All to none. So the HINTS survey did this too, but it got higher numbers in 2022. Post-Cures Act, post-required open notes, the closest we get to a question about clinical documents in the HINTS survey is this question: how easy or difficult was it to understand the health information in your online medical record? 88.7% said it was very or somewhat easy. 10.8% reported it was very or somewhat difficult. So my concern is that 10.8%, because people who find it difficult to understand medical content are going just where you're all thinking they're going, online. 2 illustrative quotes that will surprise nobody in the audience from 2 different studies of patients' perspectives on open notes. Sometimes when I'm at my appointment, it's like they're telling you so much, and then I can go back and reread the notes and it soaks in. I need to Google or figure out something I need to do. Wikipedia may help in translation work when you don't understand the crucial words. In fact, 45% of the participants interviewed in that second, more recent study agreed that they found the medical terminology in their notes difficult to understand and reported they used Google to help with unfamiliar terms and abbreviations. One real post-Cures Act response illustrates, I think, the current situation for patients as an incredible challenge and an incredible opportunity posed by open notes. A cancer patient named Ann Dabbs is active in her specific diagnosis community, and she published a piece online in a widely circulated newsletter for patients and caregivers in the context of her rare cancer. The name of the piece is Preventing Patient Portal Panic, and Dabbs starts by acknowledging the effect of the Cures Act and the open notes philosophy. She goes on to list 5 P's, which maximize potential of portals. And P number 3 is relating to health literacy. It's proper terminology. Dabbs acknowledges, and the punctuation is hers, medical terminology is hard to decipher until you are disciplined enough to educate yourself about your disease and its unique language. But she stresses that access can not only improve patient safety, but boost patient activism. A wonderful tool, she calls it, to help us each become our own best advocate. She goes on to give some tips for terminology and coping with it. Make a cheat sheet. Become familiar with stock phrases. Learn which words prompt your anxiety, fear, or misunderstanding, but are actually just medical jargon. Learn to look up common medical abbreviations, and the helpful resources this patient and advocate lists are 3: Google, WebMD, and NIH. So let me repeat, when it comes to understanding patient understanding of notes and the role of terminology in patient self-education through the medium of open notes, we actually don't know. We don't know much about patients' health literacy skills either, including their ability to navigate medical websites and distinguish good from bad information, because we generally are not investigating those skills. Instead, there's been a real reliance on patient self-report of understanding, and a dominant assumption that people who read the notes necessarily understand what they're reading. Most researchers in the literature I've found never even ask if the notes have been understood. So along those lines, I want to close by talking about this tantalizing study by Yanofsky et al. This was a 2020 survey of 225 dermatology patients in Boston. The participants in this study generally rated themselves as confident in their tech and health literacy. They did not think that looking at their health information online would be confusing. Of those 225 respondents, most were highly educated. 70% used the portal at least monthly. And the researchers asked participants to choose their own diagnosis from a short list. Just 12% were able to pick their correct diagnosis from that short list. 35.1% picked the wrong diagnosis. 47.1% didn't identify a diagnosis at all. They left it blank. And the authors write, despite these errors, 61% felt that the report was somewhat easy or very easy to understand. So back to Ann Dabb's tips for terminology again. What she's modeling for patient readers of their open notes is important, acknowledging that while some words may cause anxiety, it is still possible for patients and caregivers to inform themselves, to relieve that anxiety and become comfortable with the words. I remain concerned, though, that this is a bigger problem than words, and that ironically, a patient's own medical record may, depending on that person's health literacy, their search skills, and a bunch of other things, may be a springboard into a very deep well of misinformation. So while I am a committed advocate for access, I want it to be meaningful access. And I argue that as researchers, we need to be asking the right questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you, David. So we have time for a discussion, and I'm looking at the chat.
So maybe if you guys, if each of you could take some opportunity to talk about what you feel are next steps, because I feel like maybe on average, most of the comments were about kind of descriptive of where things are. And if you will, maybe even a fair amount of like how challenging things are right now. And so if you could describe where you see, take the opportunity again to say what you think are critical next steps, either in research or in practice, ways to move things forward. Just if each of you could take an opportunity for that.
I can get us started, I suppose. So this is something we've all talked about. So what is the ultimate root cause of acceptance of misinformation and so forth? So it's really rooted in lack of health education, beginning in the earliest grades, in which they're, and it's really never seen as valued. And Ala or Dr. Kesselman, she answers to either one, makes a case not specifically for that, but the way that science literacy and is not effectively conveyed in grade school. There's an opportunity to basically put biology and health education together, not even at a sophisticated level, but basically, and that could promote health literacy, that could promote better practices. At the social media level, that's, of course, a very complex issue. There are a lot of social, cultural, technical, political issues involved. Some of them are probably beyond the scope of this panel, but how do we build trust in institutions? I think public health institutions have to look at themselves and say, our mission has changed. I don't want to disparage any institution, but basically over the course of the pandemic, I don't think they've done as well as they possibly could. So what kind of strategies are available to them to say that, you know, we're the leading authority when it comes to matters of health? How do they reestablish that? Of course, there will always be disbelievers. There's also a role for social media platforms to be more agentive, to take a role in mitigating this. They don't seem to be so willing to do it voluntarily. It sort of waxes and wanes depending on how much pressure is put on them. And with that, I'll turn that over to whoever wants to pick up the ball and run with it. So do you want to pick up on that question?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, David. I will pick it up and then pass it to Catherine. So, you know, in thinking about it, first of all, I want to acknowledge that this is incredibly, incredibly complex. And from, you know, my decade in this, I'm coming to believe strongly that trust is the magic ingredient. But of course, it's easy to say, but how do you build trust? So again, no recipes there except for realizing that it's not possible to build trust as a kind of quick exercise at a time of crisis. So in order for the public health establishment to be trusted in a crisis situation, we need to be building this relationship and engaging with communities long term. And, you know, when I say engaging with communities, so people may have different views about science and scientists. So community events in libraries, events in schools, creating incentives for scientists to engage with the public so that they receive some value and recognition for this in their, you know, tenure and promotion events. And at the same time, I think we should, rather than target misinformation, we should focus on making the quality information reliable. It's very difficult to talk to somebody about why their belief is not a good belief. It's easier to support accurate belief and let that accurate belief kind of gradually take over. Those are my 2 cents on the topic. Kat, do you have anything to?
Yeah, I would say, you know, I've been collaborating with pediatricians for the past 4 or 5 years. And what I have come to realize is that we need to build, in my specific case, with thinking about open notes, we need to build health literacy in from like kindergarten. And what I would love is a world in which people are exposed as they grow up to the idea that looking at your own medical records is normal. And here's some ways that you can understand what's in them better. And this all feeds into science literacy and health literacy being a thing that people are equipped to deal with. I feel the same way about music. I just don't see music as life-threatening if you don't have it, but still super important. And the problem I think with the patient records is that so often people are suddenly given this stuff when they're in a health crisis or a loved one is. And that is not a mode in which it is great to learn new things. So I really want people to grow up getting used to, desensitized to accessing life relevant health information so that when there is a crisis, they are operating with skills. We wouldn't suddenly expect people to drive a car when they've never driven one before, you know, at the drop of a hat, right? Why do we make them do this with medical records?
Ooh, a car crash. I got the analogy. Dangerous. Yeah. No. I've had a lot of patients with you know, deep confusion about the information that they get out of the records, but you know, there's really no stopping this movement. You know, it's already exists. It's you know, it's their information. I mean, the logic seems pretty good. It's just is just rife with, just actually makes people terrified all the time. And the providers kind of build ways to protect themselves, like, so other people have to answer the queries that go there. And so because the providers don't have the time to interact with the queries, like, why is
Right.
my ALT abnormal? And yeah, so there's a lot of things where maybe this is just one of many examples where things are getting to be more and more complex for people. I mean, each of you have touched on, you're muted, Dave, if you want, please.
Sorry, I didn't want to.
No, please,
interrupt you.
yeah.
I did not, unfortunately, did not see Timothy Bickmore's talk yet, which I think was really relevant. But it's an interesting question. So the productive use of AI around portals, we could think of large language models as potentially, not literally ChatGPT, but something more tuned to the healthcare discipline. How might that facilitate a dialogue? How could that help patients negotiate a complex terrain? How could it engage them in such a way that they go beyond just making appointments and refilling prescriptions when they engage a portal?
Yeah, so I mean, I did get to hear Tim talk on this, and Tim and I have been colleagues for quite a long time, and we talk about these topics frequently. He's got a great paper. It's called that looks at what does Siri and Alexa tell you when you ask questions and stuff like that, and how often do they give you information that would actually be very harmful, very risky, and we call that paper "Death by Siri." There's just a huge research domain there for the types of questions people can ask, based on their educational background and health literacy skills. Like how people use these systems do vary. How people then come to trust what they hear from them do vary. The weaker the queries are and the weaker the models are, the more likely it is to confabulate. The term that they like to use is hallucinate. That is to say, make up stuff. These large language models make up stuff, and it looks kind of authoritative on the screen, but it's sometimes completely made up. And that's even besides the fact that it's just sampling from what's existing in the internet. So it represents many of the falsehoods. So Dave, you spoke about the misinformation and the chatbots generating and driving the traffic towards the misinformation. Like your review of that topic was quite on point, I think. But the large language models just suck all that up and then represent an answer based on what they see out there. And so actually AI will come into a recursive scenario where it's going to validate itself off of what's out there. The chatbots are going to generate what's out there. And so it's going to, at some point, for example, we'll get to a tipping point where maybe half the pages on Wikipedia are written by large language models. At some point, you don't know when, at some point, the tipping point is that it's actually coming to reinforce its own made up stuff.
I know there's a bunch of tools, not for patients necessarily, but oriented to healthcare. I know for example, GLASS is a diagnostic reasoning tool. So would it be possible for a large language model basically just to leverage essentially healthcare related? It would have to go beyond, obviously what medical textbooks and journals and so forth have, as a means to explain this to patients. And
well, there was a nice panel on this topic yesterday. If people want to look back, that looked at a smaller case of LLM where you give it specific information, say this article or these articles, and say summarize this for me or explain this to me. And this is a more constrained scenario that's different than asking generally. And so they presented some fairly good data about how this works and how often and when it doesn't work. And so that's a safer bet, but there's still like large efforts being done to make this work. It's called red teaming, like, you know, identifying like the dangerous things that we say to people. I think in the end, since this is going to happen outside of healthcare in a way, as well as connected to healthcare, that we have to find the guardrails, and we don't even know. I mean, a lot of this work is still to be done. Right now, it's open, like the notes are open. The internet's open, the misinformation's flying at people. It's like a fire hose, and people try to drink from it and sometimes get hurt. And the health and the system is not really rigged to support patients. I mean, I think we need a massive effort to support patients through these experiences in ways that we really haven't contemplated. Then the question is, like, how's that gonna work? How's that gonna happen? Who are those people? Are they all gonna be employed by NLM, Allah?
Well, I think the question is not even who is going to do this, but how is it going to be received, right? And getting back to the issue of trust, we may provide all kind of guardrails, but unless the public sees it as guardrails rather than an attempt to, you know, control, put them on specific tracks, it is not going to be well received. And that's my avoiding, you know, taking responsibility.
Oh, you don't think you can employ them all? I like to think about this in the following way, that as you pointed out, I think, Dave, you said this explicitly, there are other things besides health literacy happening here, but I do think health literacy, the logic and perspective of health literacy as a field, can provide a roadmap to some of the key features of what it will look like for us to be worthy of people's trust. And, you know, like, there are some things that we know in health literacy, like jargon, it's just not trustworthy. You're trying to hide from me, like that's, you know, not spending time to answer my questions, not trustworthy. Like, there's just at least some of the roadmap towards trust can be built through this field. You know, it's going to take a lot of people working on it. It's going to be a huge, diverse effort. But I think the logic of this field actually can provide a map towards some of what it would look like for us to be actually worthy of people's trust. And the large language models are not worthy of people's trust right now. They make stuff up.
That's true. Shifting that a little bit, and so
Please.
Alla in her work has talked about this, and it's common in basically science education, the recognition that science is imperfect. Science gets things wrong. Science isn't about merely establishing facts. Facts change. They evolve. So there's really a profound misunderstanding, or at least lack of understanding, of the process of science and how evidence is built, and the very concept of evidence and the value of evidence. And I think that's a problem. That's a problem, particularly in a circumstance where information is changing and knowledge is changing so dramatically. And with best intentions, you know, public health institutions disseminate erroneous information, or information that they believe to be true at one time, which turns out to be erroneous. That undermines trust. And I don't think they should necessarily stop doing that, because they have to respond in a certain way on the basis of best available information. But it's partly educating the public to that reality. And, you know, with short attention spans, you know, getting information out there is problematic.
You point out a very
Do you want to add to that?
Do you want either of the two of you want to like add? Yeah, please.
Well, I wanted to add to this, you know, to Michael's question, as far as research areas. I think a very interesting one is figuring out how to present uncertainty in the correct way, because we know from the domain of public health that if you present something as uncertain, it actually does not work out well often, that when messages are presented with uncertain information, people see the presenters as less knowledgeable, less of experts, and at the same time, when you present it as certain and then the reality comes in, then it leads to disillusionment. So how do we, what are the nuances of working with uncertainty so that it doesn't backfire, but also does not dilute the message at the start?
Yeah, I would add that if the other side is sounding super certain, it's just, I mean, I'm just remembering to the early days of the web. I mean, so much of the AI thing reminds me of how everybody reacted to the World Wide Web. Like a lot of the things are identical in terms of fears. And I think they're justified fears. I thought they were justified with the web too. But that seems like part of the problem, Ala, that maybe if we could get everybody at either pole of the spectrum to say they were uncertain, it might work better, but that never happens.
You have a question about pre-bunking, inoculation of the public against misinformation. Thoughts about this?
Well, it's partly establishing trust in institutions. Institutions have to do their part in establishing trust. Asking good questions. So not accepting things at face value. There's a tremendous rush of adrenaline, and it's very addicting in social media. When a post, accurate or erroneous, gets picked up, and you have these echo chambers, that's really, really powerful. How do you inoculate somebody against that? It's pretty challenging. And that may be beyond the scope of the health literacy question, but certainly fostering skills.
And yet health literacy could be like a resilience factor. It could be if we develop this. At least that's how I like to think about it. Pre-bunking, Ala or Catherine?
Pre-bunking. So, I mean, I think this is great. And I think it's important, who does it, and again, what relationships is this? So, for example, during the pandemic, there were some very interesting efforts by, physicians creating networks and communities where they would go into online conversations and they would leave comments in those online conversations, and was like excellent rules of engagement where, for example, you provide one answer but don't continue engaging. So I think this is all very valuable. Again, the question is who does it and how, because people who are most likely to be most trusted also have the least time to go and do this. I would love for nurses and physicians in the local hospital to spend an hour a day as part of their job going to online health forums and answering questions, but of course they can only do it on a voluntary basis.
It takes a ton of resilience. People attack you there. Like, it's not so fun.
Sure.
Catherine, you were going to say?
I would just add that that again is something that people were very worried about with the rise of patient support groups, and the expert patient communities can do a fantastic job at pre-bunking. If you're in a community of people living with what you're living with and you trust them, even if you're never going to meet them and you're anonymous, those folks can chase out misinformation pretty fast. So I have some hope for them.
Maricel is posing here in the chat a hopeful comment about the possibility of working across languages as a way to promote trust. I don't know, Marisol, I would have, this could, on a different day, you could have posed this as a big worry, right? But the loosening of the monolingual scenario, like how do we spread across in ways that actually are reaching the population better and better multilingually?
It's a hard question. So it's interesting how misinformation and conspiracy theories are updated and how they vary by culture. There's a great chapter in Alla and Catherine's book, centered in Russian, about motifs, and Alla gave an example about one of them. And so they're interesting, different driving cultural factors. But myths propagate across languages really fast, I think facilitated by the ease of automated translation. So how do you use that as a resource to combat that? I think if there's I don't have a really good answer, but I think to the extent that there's a convergence and there's accepted common truths across different societies, in different cultures, and they propagate those messages, and they're better aligned, maybe through something like the World Health Organization, then that's potentially a powerful resource. I don't think it's been effectively harnessed at this point in time.
Yeah, the large language models, though, are rapidly going in this direction. They're already available in dozens of languages, and so this is going to be an expansive way. I mean, even if just plain language summaries could then show up in all these other languages, I just don't know if they can happen without like actually expert review and say, yes, this is not a made up conclusion of this paper. This is actually what this paper says. Vishala's got a comment here. Yes. So one of the things that I think is poorly understood, this goes to actually all of you really, is kind of how to quantitate the harms. The patient who comes in shaking in fear because they misunderstood something that they saw in their record. I've had this many times, just shaking in fear. Oh, yeah. and thinking that the notification they got for breast density that basically just said, talk to your doctor because maybe you need another test, but was certain that this meant that they had cancer and that they were going to die. This happens frequently, and it's just so painful to behold. It's kind of like a harm, it's like a harm from this information flow. But it's very hard to quantitate all those harms, because it's happening mostly for people at home, just doing their thing with their device, right? And I don't know if any of you have comments about kind of how the research can expand to understand that better.
I've been an advocate for quite a while of meeting patients where they are, which is mostly not in the clinic. So you just actually put your finger on it, that we need to figure out how to non-intrusively understand what people are doing out of the hospital, in their houses, and study them there.
I think there's some evidence in the vaccine uptake. You could differentiate, and Alla talked a little bit about it. There's also followers like Naomi Wolf, who was a very well-respected feminist author. She wrote The Beauty Myth. She's got a loyal following, and she went deep down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories and became a rabid anti-vaxxer. There's evidence to suggest that her followers have experienced ill effects. I didn't articulate that very well, and I'm not sure exactly of the evidence, but there's some evidence that she's actually following her beliefs have resulted in some harm. particularly to females, because she has a large female following. Did that answer your question? I don't remember what the question was.
Yeah, it's all right. Well, I'll let you take a crack at it. Yeah.
Yes, and again, I think it's a very relevant question. At some point, Catherine and I, for a book chapter, looked at studies of people reviewing their 23andMe results, and there is a lot of misunderstanding, and there is definitely a lot of misunderstanding that actually leads to harm. There is not a lot of evidence of that. There is definitely more, so I think it's what we do. So there is, I almost want to say pre-bunking, right? Health literacy is some of the answers. So the better the health literacy, the less likely people are both to misunderstand and not to question their misunderstanding. Like you look at your open notes and you realize, okay, I'm not sure what this means. I'm going to follow up and call my doctor and drive my doctor crazy. With like my 700 questions, but it's still better than, me reacting and going into shock. Now I lost my train of thought.
We were talking about also quantifying harm.
That was part of the question as a research agenda, because it's very, it's basically the cat's out of the bag for many of these things. And there's different areas of work. One is to improve, how they, the representation of numbers, improve representation of concepts, simplify them. There's a lot of things to do. But one of the things I haven't heard people talk about is how outcomes are discerned. And one of the outcomes that's really been elusive is on the harm side. So other than just people being upset, but Dave, you brought up a very good example of basically, since, it is like in terms of vaccination, that was basically the whole society went through this example, and maybe something on the order of 1 million people could have been saved by vaccination. So that's a big harm to.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, no, so that's a great example. But in many research contexts, it's not so easy to pinpoint how you would study the harms and then to use that. Yeah.
It happens at a site. It's not visible. If I can return briefly to, I was thinking about how does a physician talk to cancer patients? So partly, the onus is partly, I think, on the health profession also to have better ways to talk about uncertainty and risk and evidence and what that all means. I mean, collectively. And reduce fear and basic, it's a very difficult thing to do, admittedly. But
so it's we're now at the hour. So thank you very much. I think it's very provocative. Each of you touched on very important topics in a very provocative way, I feel. And we have a half an hour time slot here now that'd be great if people would go to the posters. There's a different tab on the website for posters, and if you would go there's some great posters. Some of them have videos associated with them. You can click and see the author talking about their poster. It's one of those things, like, since we're not together in some hotel venue someplace, sometimes the posters get short-changed because but please do check them out, and you'll be able to communicate with the authors if you like. And then the next sessions start on the half hour. So it'd be great to see people in the rooms for that. So thank you very much for this panel, and hopefully I'll see people in about a half hour.
Thank you.
Thank
Nice
you.
talking to you.
Yeah.
Thank you very
And
much.
thank you for the attendees. Very grateful.